You're listening to The Archetype Effect, conversations redefining power, purpose and leadership for women and the coaches who guide them. I'm Ros Cardinal, leadership coach and creator of the Women's Leader Archetypes. Together we'll explore the real stories, the research and reflections that help women rise with clarity and authentic power. There's a particular kind of conversation that happens in organisations all the time. It usually isn't advertised. It may not appear on an agenda. And the person whose career is about to be affected may have absolutely no idea it's happening. Someone says, "We need somebody to lead this," or "Who could take this on?" Or perhaps, "Who do we think is ready for the next step?" And then the names start. Someone says, "What about Anna?" Another person says, "Yes, she'd be good." Someone else says, "Have you thought about Michelle?" And slowly a shortlist begins to form. Not necessarily a formal shortlist, not yet. Just a collection of names in the minds of people who have some influence over what happens next. And somewhere else in the organisation, there may be a woman who would be absolutely brilliant at that opportunity. She's capable, her work is strong, people know who she is. She may have a very good reputation. She may even have been told that she's regarded as having potential. But in that particular room, at that particular moment, nobody says her name. And I think this is one of the more uncomfortable realities of career progression. Because we've already talked this season about visibility. We've talked about the fact that good work doesn't always speak for itself. We've talked about making contribution visible, about reputation, about perception, about the importance of understanding the organisation around you rather than assuming that performance alone determines what happens next. But there's another step, and it's quite a different one. You can be visible and still not be advocated for. People can know your name and never put it forward. They can think highly of you. They can tell you that you're doing a wonderful job. They can give you excellent performance feedback. They can mentor you. They can encourage you. They can tell you that you should apply for the next role. And still, when you're not in the room, they may not say anything. That's the distinction I want to explore today. Because there's a difference between being known and being backed. A difference between somebody recognising your capability and somebody being willing to do something with that recognition. Sometimes advocacy is quite small. Have you thought about her? Sometimes it's more direct. I think she's ready. Sometimes it's an introduction. You two should meet. Sometimes it's somebody creating an opportunity that you didn't even know existed. I'd like her involved in this. And sometimes it carries considerably more weight. I know her work. I trust her judgment. I would put her forward. The last one matters because when somebody says that about you in a room where they themselves have credibility, influence or standing, they're not simply passing on information. They're putting some of their own judgment behind you. And that changes the conversation. If I'm sitting in a room with people who don't know you particularly well, and I say, "I've worked closely with her, she's very capable, I think she could do this." The people around that table aren't evaluating only what they know about you. They're also evaluating what they know about me. Do they trust my judgment? Do they think I understand what this role requires? Do they know that I don't recommend people lightly? Because if they do, then my reputation has, in a very small way, become part of the evidence they're using to assess you. I'm putting my reputation behind yours. And that, I think, is where sponsorship starts to become much more interesting than simply having somebody in your corner. A sponsor isn't just cheering for you, they're using their voice, their access, their credibility, their political capital and sometimes their own reputation on your behalf. Which means there's a question I think is worth sitting with. Not who knows me, not even who thinks I'm good at what I do, but who would put my name forward? And perhaps even more importantly, who would be prepared to put their reputation behind mine? For years, one of the most common pieces of career advice given to women has been find a mentor. And mentoring can be enormously valuable. I've had mentors in my own career. I've mentored other people. I've seen what a good mentoring relationship can do. A good mentor can help you make sense of what's happening around you. They can challenge your thinking. They can help you see possibilities you hadn't considered. They can share the benefit of experience without you having to acquire all of it the hard way. They can help you prepare for a difficult conversation, think through a career decision, understand where you need to develop, or work out what your next move might be. But there's something a mentor doesn't necessarily do. They don't necessarily open the door. And that's where mentoring and sponsorship are often confused. They can involve the same person. A mentor can be a sponsor. A sponsor might also mentor you. But they're not the same thing. The simplest distinction I've found is this. Mentors help prepare you for opportunities. Sponsors help connect you to opportunities. Imagine you're interested in moving into a more senior leadership role. A mentor might sit down with you and help you think through what that role requires. They might give you feedback on where you're ready and where you still have some development to do. They might help you understand how senior leaders operate differently. They might encourage you to apply. All incredibly useful. A sponsor does something different. The sponsor is in a conversation with someone else and says, I think you should consider her. That's the shift. The mentor is primarily working with you. The sponsor is also working for you in the system around you. And that means sponsorship involves something that mentoring doesn't always require. Political capital. Not politics in the grubby sense. I mean the ability to influence what happens. Access to people. Credibility with decision makers. Knowledge of where opportunities are emerging. Relationships across the organisation. Enough standing that when this person says, I think she's ready, other people take that judgment seriously. And that brings us back to the idea of reputation. Because a genuine sponsor is doing more than being supportive. They're making a judgment about you in front of other people. They're saying, in effect, I know enough about this person to back her. And there is some risk in that. Imagine I strongly recommend somebody for a significant role. I tell people she's ready. I use my influence to get her considered. And then it becomes very clear that she wasn't remotely ready. That doesn't only affect her reputation. At some level, it affects mine. People might quite reasonably think, Ros, what were you seeing? Why did you recommend her? Can I trust your judgment next time? Now, I'm not suggesting that every sponsorship decision is some enormous reputational gamble. Usually it isn't. But there is a transaction of trust happening. The sponsor has accumulated credibility within the organisation, and they're prepared to place some of that credibility behind someone else. That's why I keep coming back to the phrase, putting your reputation behind someone. Because I think it captures something that support and even advocacy don't quite capture. If I encourage you privately, I'm supporting you. If I speak positively about you, I'm advocating for you. But when I say to someone with the power to create an opportunity, I know her work, I think she's ready, I'd back her for this. I've crossed another threshold. My judgment has become part of your case. And this is also why some of the advice about sponsorship troubles me. You'll sometimes hear, you need to find yourself a sponsor, as though sponsorship is another networking task. Identify a powerful person, arrange coffee, ask them to sponsor you. Tick. But think about what you're actually asking. You're asking someone to put some of their professional credibility behind your career. That requires more than a pleasant conversation over coffee. They need a reason to believe in you. They need enough exposure to your work, your judgment, your character, or your potential to feel confident advocating for you. And they need something else as well. They need relevant influence. Because you can have someone who believes in you enormously, but has very little access to the people or opportunities that matter for where you want to go. Wonderful advocate, not necessarily an effective sponsor. And you can have someone with enormous organisational power who barely knows you. Powerful person, not yet a credible sponsor. Sponsorship sits at the intersection of those two things: belief in you and influence with others. And when those come together, something quite powerful becomes possible. Someone with political clout can say your name in a room that you aren't in and put their own reputation behind it. Years ago, I was emceeing a conference where one of the speakers was a woman called Heather. Heather was with KPMG, and she spoke about something her organisation had done that really stayed with me. They'd identified a group of leaders they believed had the potential to progress into more senior roles, ultimately including partnership. And instead of simply giving those people mentors, they gave them sponsors. Heather was allocated a sponsor based in Sydney. Now, I'm telling you this from my memory of Heather's presentation, so I don't want to put words into her mouth or pretend I remember every detail of how the program operated. But I remember very clearly the distinction she made. Her sponsor wasn't there simply to give her career advice. The relationship had been deliberately established with the expectation that this person would help advance her career, put her forward for opportunities, help her make connections, increase her exposure, advocate for her, use their own organisational reach to help create opportunities for someone the organisation had already identified as having leadership potential. And Heather talked about how valuable that relationship had been to her career. She did ultimately become a partner at KPMG. What fascinated me when I heard her speak wasn't simply that sponsorship had worked for Heather. It was that KPMG hadn't left it to chance. Think about that. They had already identified these people as emerging leaders. So this wasn't primarily a capability problem. They weren't saying, here are some women who aren't quite good enough yet, let's fix them. They'd already recognised their potential, but recognition wasn't considered enough. There was another piece of the career system that needed attention. Someone with greater organisational reach was deliberately connected to that emerging leader and expected to take an active interest in helping her progress. That's very different from the way sponsorship often happens. Because in many organisations, sponsorship is almost entirely informal. Nobody calls it sponsorship. There isn't a meeting where someone says, congratulations, you've been allocated David. It just develops organically. A senior leader works with someone and is impressed by them. They give them another opportunity, then another. They introduce them to someone. They invite them into a meeting. They mention their name to a colleague. They recommend them for a project. Over time, they begin to take an interest in that person's career. And none of that is inherently problematic. In fact, it's a very human way for professional relationships to develop. The problem is what happens when we assume that an informal process will distribute opportunity evenly, because informal relationships aren't random. They're shaped by proximity, by familiarity, by who works with whom, by who gets exposure to senior people in the first place, by who gets invited into particular meetings, by who has opportunities to demonstrate what they can do, by who feels familiar, by who someone feels comfortable with, by who reminds a senior leader, perhaps unconsciously, of themselves at the same stage of their career. And once you see sponsorship through that lens, it becomes part of the hidden ecology of an organisation. On the organisation chart, two emerging leaders may look almost identical. Same level, similar experience, similar performance, both regarded as talented. But underneath the organisational chart, their worlds may be completely different. One has a senior person who regularly says, "Give her a go." The other doesn't. One has someone who makes introductions. The other doesn't. One gets mentioned when an opportunity is still only an idea. The other finds out about it when the email goes around. One has somebody with political clout quietly building confidence in her across the organisation. The other may be every bit as capable and every bit as visible, but nobody's actively doing that work for her. That's the advocacy gap. And this is where I think organisations need to look very carefully at the difference between developing talent and creating access for talent. Because we've become very good at the first one, we send people to leadership programs, we give them coaches, we run mentoring schemes, we identify high potentials, we put women through development programs, all potentially valuable. But if the same people continue to receive the informal introductions, the stretch opportunities, recommendations, and reputational backing that accelerate careers, then development alone won't change very much. We can spend years preparing someone beautifully for an opportunity without ever examining how people actually get connected to those opportunities. And that's what I found so interesting about Heather's story. Her organisation had taken something that normally sits in the informal system, who is prepared to back whom, and made it deliberate. Not, let's hope one of the senior partners notices her. Not, she should really network more. Not, perhaps she needs a mentor. But we believe this person has potential. So who is going to put some political capital behind helping that potential go somewhere? That's a very different question. And this is where we need to talk about gender. Because if sponsorship were distributed evenly, this would simply be an interesting piece of career strategy. But there are good reasons to question whether it is. One of the problems with informal systems is that they can look completely neutral from the outside. Nobody has written a policy saying sponsor him, but don't sponsor her. Nobody necessarily intends to exclude somebody. But sponsorship depends on relationships. And relationships develop inside an organisational environment that is already shaped by who holds power, who has access to whom, and who spends time together. Think about how informal sponsorship begins. A senior leader sees someone doing good work. They develop confidence in them. Perhaps they have a conversation after a meeting. They work together on a difficult project. The senior leader gives them a slightly bigger opportunity. They deliver. Trust grows. Then another opportunity appears, and the senior leader thinks of them again. Eventually, without anybody ever formally declaring it, that senior person has started sponsoring their career. That's a perfectly understandable human process. But now ask, who gets enough proximity for that process to begin? Who gets regular exposure to the senior leaders? Who gets invited onto the high-profile projects? Who has informal conversations with them? Who gets to travel with them? Who gets included in the dinner after the conference? Who feels comfortable suggesting a coffee? Who gets seen not only doing the work, but thinking, influencing, making decisions and handling pressure? And who feels comfortable to the senior leader? Because sponsorship involves reputational risk, if I'm going to put my reputation behind you, trust matters. And human beings don't build trust in a perfectly objective way. We tend to find some people easier to connect with than others. Similarity can play a part. Shared backgrounds, shared interests, shared experiences, sometimes simply familiarity. None of that requires somebody to sit there consciously thinking, I'm going to sponsor someone who looks like me. That's precisely why informal systems deserve scrutiny. And there's another complication for women. In many organisations, particularly as you move further up the hierarchy, the people with the greatest political capital are still disproportionately men. So if you're a woman coming through the leadership pipeline, some of the people best positioned to sponsor you may be senior men. And I've heard conversations over the years about the discomfort that can sometimes exist around those relationships. Concern about how a close mentoring or sponsorship relationship between a senior man and a more junior woman might be perceived. I remember coming across research on this some years ago, and I think it may have been Australian research, but I haven't been able to reliably locate the original study again. So I'm not going to quote a statistic or attribute it to an organisation when I can't verify it. But the broader issue is worth noticing. If a senior man is comfortable taking a younger man to dinner, travelling with him, having regular coffees, introducing him around his network, and taking a close interest in his career, but feels more cautious about doing those same things with a younger woman because of how that relationship could be perceived, then even without any discriminatory intent, access to informal sponsorship can diverge. And that's one reason I keep coming back to Heather's story. Because when sponsorship is deliberately established by the organisation, some of that ambiguity disappears. Everybody knows why the relationship exists. The emerging leader knows, the sponsor knows, the organisation knows. The sponsor has permission, in fact a mandate, to take an active interest in that person's advancement. That doesn't magically remove every bias or guarantee an outcome, but it changes the architecture around the relationship. And perhaps that's the bigger organisational lesson. If sponsorship is an important mechanism through which careers advance, then we shouldn't only ask, who has a sponsor? We should ask, how does sponsorship happen here? Who tends to receive it? At what point in their career? Who tends to sponsor whom? What kinds of exposure lead someone to be sponsored? And are we assuming that everyone with potential has an equal chance of forming those relationships? Because there's a subtle trap here. An organisation can have a beautifully designed formal talent process and still have a completely different informal opportunity process operating underneath it. On paper, everyone may have access to the same jobs, but before the job appears, some people have had years of people saying, watch her, give her this one, introduce her to James. She should be in that meeting. Let her present this. I think she's ready. Those moments accumulate, and by the time a formal opportunity arrives, one person may have an entire network of organisational confidence sitting behind them. Another may arrive with only their own track record. That's why sponsorship isn't simply about having powerful friends, and it certainly isn't about circumventing merit. At its best, sponsorship helps merit travel. It takes capability that already exists and gives it reach through someone else's credibility, access, and political capital. Which means that if organisations are serious about who gets to advance, they need to pay attention not only to how talent is assessed, they need to pay attention to who gets backed. So by this point, you might be thinking, right, I need a sponsor. And this is where some of the career advice around sponsorship becomes a little unhelpful. Because you can ask somebody to mentor you. You can say, I really value your experience. Would you be willing to meet with me occasionally and help me think through my development? That's a perfectly reasonable request. But sponsorship doesn't work quite like that. Imagine walking up to the most influential person you know and saying, would you please put your professional reputation behind me in rooms I'm not in? It sounds ridiculous when you say it like that. Because sponsorship isn't really a role you appoint someone to. Unless, of course, you're working in an organisation that has deliberately created a sponsorship program like the one Heather described. Informally, sponsorship tends to emerge because somebody has developed enough confidence in you that they're prepared to act on it. And that means there's a tension here. You can't demand sponsorship, but you don't have to sit around passively hoping someone powerful eventually notices you either. There are things you can influence. The first is evidence. If somebody is going to put their reputation behind yours, what have they actually seen? Not what does your CV say, not what have they heard through the grapevine. What have they personally observed that gives them confidence in your judgment? Have they seen you handle something difficult? Have they seen you thinking strategically? Have they watched you influence people without relying on authority? Have they seen you recover when something goes wrong? Have they seen how you operate under pressure? Because sponsorship isn't simply, I like this person. It's, I have enough evidence to trust this person with an opportunity. And that distinction is important. The second thing is aspiration. Do the people who might advocate for you actually know where you want to go? This is something I see women underestimate. We assume people will somehow work it out. Surely my manager knows I'd like a bigger role. Surely they know I'm interested in strategy. Surely they know I'd love international experience. Perhaps they do. But perhaps they think you're perfectly happy where you are. Perhaps they know you're ambitious, but have no idea what you're ambitious for. Perhaps an opportunity comes up and they don't connect it with you because you've never given them the information that would allow them to make that connection. A sponsor can't connect you to an aspiration they don't know you have. And the third is reach. This is where we come back to political intelligence. Who has influence in the part of the system you want to move into? Not simply, who is the most senior person I know? That's a bit too blunt. Power is contextual. Someone can have an impressive title and very little influence over the opportunity you're interested in. Another person might sit 2 levels lower, but be deeply trusted by the decision maker, understand exactly what's coming down the pipeline, and have enormous credibility in that particular part of the organisation. So the question isn't who is powerful, it's who has relevant influence, who is connected to the people, conversations and opportunities that matter for where you want to go. And then there's a fourth piece that I think is easy to miss. Reciprocity. Not transactional reciprocity. I'm not suggesting you owe somebody something because they advocate for you. But sponsorship is a relationship in which your performance has consequences beyond you. If someone puts their reputation behind you and you get the opportunity, what you do next matters. You deliver. You behave with integrity. You use good judgment. You don't make the sponsor regret having backed you. And over time, perhaps you do the same for somebody else. Because this is one of the ways organisational opportunity travels. Somebody backed me. Eventually, I acquired enough credibility and influence to back somebody else. That's where sponsorship becomes more than an individual career strategy. It becomes part of the culture of an organisation. Which brings us back to a question I asked earlier. Who would put my name forward? If you have an immediate answer to that question, that's wonderful. But if you don't, I don't want you to leave this episode thinking, great, another thing I'm doing wrong. That's not the point. I want you to get curious. Perhaps lots of people know your work, but very few influential people have actually seen you operate. Perhaps senior people know you're capable, but don't know what you want next. Perhaps you have wonderful mentors, but they're outside your organisation and can't influence the opportunities inside it. Perhaps you have strong advocates in your own function, but you're trying to move somewhere their influence doesn't travel. Or perhaps, and this matters, you're operating in an organisational environment where sponsorship simply isn't distributed very well. Those are different problems, and they require very different responses. So rather than asking, how do I get myself a sponsor, I'd ask something more useful. What would need to be true for someone with relevant influence to confidently put their reputation behind me? That's a political intelligence question, because it asks you to understand not only yourself, but the system through which opportunity actually moves. So I want to give you something practical to do with this, and it isn't go and find yourself a sponsor. Instead, I want you to map the advocacy that already exists around your career. Take a piece of paper and divide it into 3 columns. At the top of the first column, write, who knows me? These are the people who know your work. They've seen what you contribute. They understand something about your capability. Some might know you extremely well. Others might simply know your professional reputation. Now, in the second column, write, who advises me? These are your mentors, your trusted colleagues, perhaps a former boss, perhaps a coach. The people you go to when you need perspective, challenge, wisdom, or help thinking something through. There may be plenty of overlap between the first 2 columns. And then write the third heading, who advocates for me? And don't rush this one, because I'm not asking who likes you. I'm not asking who says nice things about you. I'm not even asking who believes you have potential. I'm asking who acts on that belief. Who has introduced you to somebody because they thought the connection would help you? Who has recommended you for something? Who has deliberately created exposure for you? Who has said, you should talk to her? Who's put your name forward for a project, a role, a client, a committee, or a board opportunity? Who has said in one form or another, I back her? You may discover you have several people in that third column. You may discover you have one. And you may discover that it's empty. That's information, not a judgment, because now we can get more specific. Think about one opportunity you'd genuinely like to have in the next year or 2. Not necessarily a promotion. It might be leading a major piece of work, moving into another part of the organisation, getting exposure to the board, working internationally, taking responsibility for an important client, joining an executive committee, whatever represents meaningful movement for you. Write it down and then ask, if that opportunity appeared tomorrow, who would put my name forward? Notice how different that question is from who knows I could do it. You may have 10 people who know you could do it. I'm asking who would act on that knowledge. Who would be in a position to hear about the opportunity? Who would have access to the relevant people? Whose recommendation would carry weight? And who knows you well enough to make that recommendation with confidence? Because this is where we bring together the two sides of sponsorship we've been talking about. Belief in you and influence with others. If somebody has enormous influence but doesn't really know your work, there's a gap. If somebody knows your work intimately and thinks you're extraordinary but has no connection to the opportunity you're seeking, there's a different gap. And if somebody has both, that's a relationship worth noticing. Not exploiting, not suddenly inviting them for coffee because you've decided they're strategically useful. Noticing. Because political intelligence isn't about treating human relationships like pieces on a chessboard. It's about understanding the ecology you're already part of. And once you've mapped that ecology, there's one final question. For each person who could potentially advocate for you, ask, what would they need to know, see, or trust about me to confidently put their reputation behind mine? Maybe they need to know what you want. Maybe they need more exposure to your work. Maybe they know you're technically excellent, but they haven't seen you lead. Maybe they've seen you lead, but don't know you're interested in a particular direction. Maybe you need opportunities to demonstrate capability outside your current function. Maybe nothing needs to change at all. Perhaps there's already someone quietly advocating for you, and you've never really recognised what they were doing. And there's one more possibility. You may look at your map and realise that the people who know you, advise you, and believe in you are all concentrated in exactly the same part of the organisation. Your immediate team, your profession, your geographic location, your current level. That's useful information too, because your network may be strong, but its reach may be narrow. And that gives you a much more intelligent development question than how do I network more? Perhaps the question is, where does my reputation need greater reach? Not because you need hundreds more contacts, but because the opportunity you want may live in a different part of the organisational ecology where your current relationships don't travel. And that's what I want you to take from this exercise. Don't measure your network by how many people you know. Look at what your relationships actually do. Who knows you? Who develops you? Who advocates for you? And who has both the confidence and the political capital to say when the right opportunity appears, I think we should consider her. So let's come back to that room. The opportunity has emerged. Perhaps it's a role. It could be a project. Perhaps it's a client, a secondment, a board position, an introduction. Maybe it's something that doesn't even have a name yet. Just a conversation about what the organisation needs next. And you're not there. Someone asks, who should we consider? We've spent a lot of this season talking about what happens before that moment. The quality of your work, whether that work is visible, how people perceive you, how well you understand the hidden ecology of the organisation around you, the relationships you build. All of those things matter. But this episode adds another piece, because being known isn't the same as being backed. There's a difference between someone thinking, she's very good, and someone saying, what about her? There's a difference between someone believing you have potential and someone being prepared to use their own access and influence to help that potential go somewhere. And there's a difference between someone giving you good advice about your career and someone putting some of their own reputation behind it. That's sponsorship. Not favouritism, not someone pulling strings to get an unqualified person into a role. and not a powerful person handing you a career you haven't earned. At its best, sponsorship is someone who knows enough about your capability to say, I believe she's ready, and I'm prepared to put my judgment behind that. I think that's why this matters so much, because careers don't move only through formal processes. Opportunity moves through human systems, through conversations, introductions, recommendations, trust, judgment, and people willing to use the political capital they've accumulated to create possibilities for someone else. Sometimes that happens naturally. Sometimes, as in the story I shared about Heather, organisations deliberately create the conditions for it. And perhaps more organisations should. Because if we're serious about creating more equitable pathways into leadership, it's not enough to ask whether people have access to development. We also need to ask whether they have access to advocacy. Who gets coached? Who gets mentored? But also, who gets backed? And for those of us navigating our own careers, I think there's something important here too. You don't need to turn every relationship into a strategy. You don't need to start collecting powerful people. And please don't finish this episode with a list headed potential sponsors and start sending awkward coffee invitations. That's not what this is about. It's about seeing the system more clearly, understanding where your reputation travels, understanding who's actually seen enough of you to trust you, understanding where influence sits, and recognising the relationships in which belief in you and influence with others might come together. Because sometimes the question isn't, do people know who I am? It's, when it matters, will anybody say my name? And perhaps the deepest question of all is, who would be prepared to put their reputation behind mine? That's the question I'd like you to sit with this week. And I've created a field guide to accompany this episode, including the advocacy map we've talked through today, so you don't need to remember all of this or try to recreate the exercise yourself. You'll find the link to download it in the show notes. Use it to map who knows you, who advises you, and who actively advocates for you. Then choose one opportunity you genuinely like to move towards and ask, if this opportunity appeared tomorrow, who would put my name forward? And if you discover a gap, don't immediately rush to fix it. Get curious about it, because once you can see how opportunity and advocacy move through the system around you, you can start making much more deliberate choices about where you build trust, where you need greater reach, and where your work needs to be experienced, not simply seen. And there's another side to this conversation that I don't want us to miss. If you already have influence, whose name are you saying? Who are you introducing? Who are you putting forward? Whose capability have you seen that other people haven't? Who could benefit from some of the political capital you've spent years building? Because sponsorship isn't only something we should hope to receive. At some point in our careers, it becomes something we have the opportunity to give. And perhaps that's one of the most powerful ways we can change the hidden ecology of our organisations. Not simply by opening doors for ourselves, but by becoming someone who opens them for others. Until next time, keep noticing the hidden rules. Thanks for joining me on the Archetype Effect. If this episode sparked an insight, share it with a woman who leads, or leave a review so more women can find these conversations. Until next time, lead with purpose and power that feels like you.